If there's a war, Russia knows it can win. Not just Vladimir Putin, but everyone. It's a war on Russia's doorstep. It's a war in eastern Ukraine or even in western Ukraine, because you're talking about a force that can be built up and then ultimately commutes to the fight. Who cannot win in Ukraine? We can't. We're too far away. We can't mass the forces. We can't build up to do anything. And the Europeans, they lack both the resolve, the will, and the understanding to field a force that could defeat the Russians. So it's all nonsense. It's a dead end. We can't win it. Now, I think privately there have been moments of lucidity when Donald Trump has effectively said that. When he said in the Oval Office to Zelensky, you don't have any cards to play. What he didn't know is that his donors were on Zelensky's team, and his donors were going to tell him, you have to stick with this, Donald, because his donors, these are the ones driving us to war with Iran, driving us to war with anybody Israel doesn't like, also hate Russia. Okay, it's not an American interest. But whose payroll are all of these people on?
What he's saying cuts through all the political theater. Geography alone decides this war, and Russia fights on its own doorstep, while the West fights on borrowed distance and borrowed will. Europe lacks the force, the morale, and even the clarity to challenge Moscow, and Washington knows it. The tragedy is that even when leaders privately admit the truth, they remain captive to donors who treat foreign policy like a personal investment portfolio. This isn't strategy. It's influence masquerading as patriotism, and when a nation lets private interests steer it toward conflicts it cannot win, the outcome is never victory, only deeper entanglement and eventual reckoning.
Back in the 90s, the view was, it doesn't matter. We can sell our country down the road because it doesn't hurt us. We're great, we're powerful, no one can ever touch us, nothing can ever harm us. So what difference does it make? What difference does it make if another few million illegals come into the country? What difference does it make if we embroil ourselves in conflicts in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or Eastern Europe? Because we're great, we're powerful, nobody can challenge us, nobody can touch us. Well, that's wrong. It's dead wrong. And we are more vulnerable today than ever in our history. We have created a situation of extreme danger to the United States, not just militarily, but financially and economically. You know, someone was talking to me earlier today and said, you know, the problem, Doug, and this is someone overseas who's very heavily engaged in the banking industry. He said, you know, when people look at us and at the United States, and then they look at China, they conclude very quickly that China's economy, which has doubled, tripled in size since 2005, given its population, given the successful implementation of state-sponsored capitalism in China, even though China has a great deal of debt, just as we do, everyone is confident that the Chinese economy is going to outgrow its debt. No one believes, based upon what they're seeing inside the United States today, that the United States has any chance whatsoever of growing out of its debt. Absolutely not. And so the world is moving away from us into this thing called BRICS. And that puts everything at risk. So my point is that the people talking in these terms are not only dangerously wrong, they're putting the country in severe jeopardy, because what we need now more than ever before in our history is peace and stability. The stability that comes from peace, that is the foundation for prosperity. We need to dump all of this overseas and look very carefully at what we need to do here at home to rebuild our economy, rebuild this financial system to make sense, to end the financialization of our economy, to start producing and building things, which we have not done for decades.
What Macgregor describes here exposes the collapsing center of the Ukrainian project. When a government is already preparing its escape route, it signals a regime that knows its own foundations are dust, and on the ground, the sentiment is shifting quietly but unmistakably. People want an end, even if that end means political upheaval. Yet in Washington and across Europe, the same political class keeps pushing the conflict, insulated from its consequences and enriched by its continuation. That's the real scandal, a war sustained by leaders who never pay the price, but somehow always grow wealthier in the process.
There are preparations to fly Zelensky and much of his inner circle to Israel, where they have immunity against extradition for criminal proceedings, and that's what they're going to need when they finish up in Ukraine. They've got one foot right now in Ukraine, and the other foot really in the door of the aircraft to fly them out. People don't realize how weak and fragile this Ukrainian government is. Earlier today, I received some information from Eastern Europe, and I was told that people are coming out of the basements and homes in Prokhovsk, and they're saying, to the Russians, thank God, let's get this over with, help end this war. And many of them are saying what initially back in 2022 in February, March, April, were saying in Luhansk and Donetsk, what took you so long? I think increasingly the population that lives in eastern Ukraine and much of the population in the West desperately wants an end to this war. And they realize it will only end with one outcome. That is the elimination of Zelensky and his regime. It's a permanent trigger for conflict and war. Now that satisfies certain people in Washington, D.C. and the current globalist governments in Europe. But it is not a long-term solution for peace and stability in Europe. It's the opposite. So people like McConnell or Slotkin or Lindsey Graham, any of these people, they all sing the same tune. Somebody was saying the other day, well, the Republicans have made such a mess of this, the Democrats are going to end up taking over on the midterms, and then they'll probably win in 28. And I looked at them and I said, so what difference? What's the difference? That's the truth. These people are all playing more or less on the same team. And that's why you've got to go back and ask the question, how is it that you're a millionaire? How did you become a millionaire after you came to Washington, D.C.? Show us the sources of your cash.
What Macgregor describes here reveals a government already preparing its own exit route, a regime that senses its collapse long before the public is allowed to acknowledge it. On the ground, people simply want the war to end, and they increasingly understand that peace requires political change, not more escalation. Yet in Washington and Europe, the same chorus of politicians pushes the conflict forward, because the incentives that fund them never change. That's the real continuity in Western politics, not ideology, but the network of interests that enriches its participants. And once you ask where that money comes from, you begin to understand why the war has lasted this long.
63, when Denmark declared war on Prussia and Austria over a territorial dispute, there was suddenly an outburst of patriotic fervor in England saying we should send our army to the Danish peninsula and help the Danes fight the Prussians and the Austrians. There was a very brilliant prime minister who came to power at the time. His name was Palmerston, a serious conservative and thoughtful man. And Palmerston said very cleverly to the gathered body, we know that we can send 100,000 of our troops, which would have been virtually the whole British Army, to Denmark, and they would give a good account of themselves, to which everybody said, hear, 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 He said, however, we also realize that however much we may like the Danes and want to help them, that 100,000 British troops are not going to rescue the Danes from eventual defeat by the Prussians and the Austrians. In fact, if we were to do this, the Prussians and the Austrians would mobilize their respective armed forces and their nations, and we could not compete with that. So it makes no sense for us to join this conflict. Now, stop and think about that. This is 1863. The British Empire in 1863 was far larger, far more powerful, far more extensive than British power today is, dramatically so. And yet that prime minister had the common sense and the intelligence to recognize the limitations of British power. And he knew that in 1863, together with the Danes, there was no chance of success against Prussia and Austria. We need more people with common sense and willingness to tell the truth in public. Instead, we have these false narratives that have been cooked up, for years by MI6. We're talking about a level of control over the media, influence over the media, influence over what is discussed or isn't discussed in the West that really is worse than what I remember studying about the Soviets in the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s. That's pretty frightening if you stop and think about it. They have successfully crushed anyone who challenges anything in the narrative that they insist is true. It's not going to last much longer. The British, surprisingly, have proved as a population to be remarkably obedient, but it's coming to an end. I think we're going to see it end across Europe. And obviously, people will sit out there and say, well, Doug, you said these things before. Yes, I have. And it's going to happen. But remember, the world is not an American microwave oven. You say something, Americans, oh, well, that's happened now. It'll happen next week. If you tell Americans that if we go into Venezuela, that this could fatally damage us financially and economically, that it could undermine our position as the financial hegemon in the Western world, I say, oh, well, that's ridiculous. How could that happen? But when it does happen in 6 months or 8 months or 9 months, whatever it turns out to be, everybody says, well, how could this have ever occurred? Why didn't we see this coming? It's coming. Europe is going to fall apart and it's going to rebuild itself. It's going to be tough. It's going to be ugly. But eventually there will be new governments. And these new governments are going to be completely disinterested in any war with Russia under any circumstances.
Macgregor's point here is a reminder of something our modern leaders seem to have forgotten. Great powers endure not through bravado, but through the humility to recognize limits. Palmerston understood that in 1863, yet today's political class behaves as if history no longer applies to them. Instead of honesty, the West is governed by curated narratives and media choreography designed to suppress dissent rather than confront reality. But repression isn't resilience, it's decay in slow motion. And as Europe drifts toward fragmentation, new governments will emerge that have no appetite for war with Russia because they'll inherit the ruins left behind by those who chased illusions.
We've seen a lot of evidence that the pace of operations has picked up. We now know that Russian forces have between themselves and the Dnieper River essentially open rolling terrain. The ball is truly in Russia's court. Moscow has to decide what it wants to do. The longer the stupidity drags on in Western Europe, the more threats that are made against Russia, the more likely it is that the Russians conclude that the only safety they can aspire to is the complete taking of territory up to the Dnieper River. Because they'll see the Dnieper River as a natural barrier, a natural defensive line. That's what they'll do. And I still say that whatever happens, they will end up with both Odessa and Kharkov that are historically Russian cities, not Ukrainian. And when those cities are in their hands, they may be willing to talk about alternatives to the status quo, but not much until they get there. So I think the Russians now have the ability to end this by the end of the year on terms that they find acceptable. They would prefer what I discussed earlier, for these governments in London and Paris and Berlin to change. And they may. There's a real potential for that. But in the meantime, they're just going to have to press ahead. And they can expect nothing from us. And by the way, the interesting part is, President Trump has largely walked away from this business. I mean, he's willing to say, here's a 28-point plan, go look at it. But he's not really interested in it. Why is he not really interested? Because he can't be at the center of it. Remember, President Trump's all about optics. If this does not create the illusion that he wants, that somehow or another he's settled his, whatever it is, 19th war, whatever count he's aspiring to. If he can't say that, then he's not really interested anyway. So I think he'll play it off, which is what he's effectively done with these promises of more military assistance to Ukraine. Most of that material will not arrive for a year, 2 years, or longer. By the time that happens, there won't be a Ukraine unless somebody wakes up quickly and recognizes that they need a new government in Kiev. And the one that's there is a permanent obstacle to peace. Who knows? Everything is possible. It's not impossible. Something like that could happen. But right now, the Russians have to assume no change in the near term, which means they march west.
This is the uncomfortable truth. Once Russia reaches open terrain and faces no meaningful resistance, the strategic initiative becomes entirely theirs. And if Western rhetoric, keeps escalating while offering no real capability, Moscow will naturally seek security and deeper territorial control. What's striking is that the West keeps pretending diplomacy is possible without first accepting battlefield realities. Even Trump's disengagement underscores the hollowness of the political class, more concerned with optics than outcomes. And while leaders posture, Russia simply advances because it assumes correctly that nothing in the immediate future is going to change.